Good morning, baseball fans, and welcome back to Dan's Vintage Baseball PC. Do not be fooled by the fancy name. It's just me and some baseball cards. And today it is just me. It's the Saturday before Thanksgiving, a family holiday. So I thought I'd do a little show about some family history, which relates directly to vintage baseball. Um, so my grandfather was born in Ireland in 1890. He came to the United States on a boat in 1912 and joined up with the Army for World War One and rose to the rank of sergeant. After the war was over, he was sworn in as a United States citizen on an Army base in Greenville, South Carolina. He lived in Queens for the rest of his life, Queens and then Nassau County for the rest of his life. Raised four children, was married for 50, 60 years. I'd have to do the math, but it's a lot of time. Anyway, so my mother was his oldest child. And my grandfather was a fan of sport, as they say. He was particularly enamored with the racetrack. He was apparently very good at it. And also became a baseball fan. Not a sport that he was familiar with from his home country, but when he came to the United States, he became a baseball fan. And he tells the story of having seen Babe Ruth play at Yankee Stadium. And Babe comes up, hits the ball. My grandfather jumps up cheering, only to realize that everyone else in the crowd is sitting down and looking at him with a matter of disdain. Because Babe Ruth had just popped up to the infield. So a gentleman who didn't know the game that well might think that that was something special, but it wasn't. Anyway, so he learned the game. Learned the game to the point where in 1942, he went to Florida and visited three spring training sites and took 8 photos, which I'm going to show you shortly. Um, some of whom are of baseball players who are sort of lost to history. But the pictures do include two major Hall of Famers. Now, when I was a kid, I was shown these photos by my mother, and after I became an adult, I was given these photos because of my interest in baseball and baseball cards, and told you can have these photos as long as you don't sell them. Uh, my mother, bless her soul, I have not sold these photos, nor will I ever sell these photos. So my grandfather goes down to Florida in 1942, and I don't know much about the trip. I asked my older brother, who was an adult when my grandfather passed away in 1970 at the age of 80. Um, I asked him if he knew anything about it. He didn't. So everything I know about this trip and these photos comes from what my mother told me. And so my grandfather, and looking at what's written on the photos and also doing some sleuthing, he must have driven down because he went to 3 spring training sites. One was in Sanford, Florida. One was in Miami, and one was in Fort Lauderdale. Now, Miami and Fort Lauderdale are pretty close to each other. If you know Florida, it's probably about 20 minute drive. But Sanford, Florida, is in northern Florida. In fact, it's a northern suburb of Orlando at this point. So I'm assuming that he drove down. And he had children at that point. My mother was 21 years old in 20 years old in 1942, and she was the oldest. So I think my youngest aunt on that family was probably about 15, maybe. So he had children, but they were not little children. So anyway, let me go through the photos. I'll show you the first two, and then I'll show you a screenshot, which might give you a little bit of a better one. This is a photo taken at the Philadelphia Phillies spring training in Miami Beach, Florida. And this is Bobby Bragan, a person who I didn't really know that much about. But doing a little research, Bobby Bragan's actually kind of an important player and person in Major League history. He played for about a half a dozen years for the Phillies. And then he became minor league manager and ultimately became a major league manager of the Milwaukee Braves in 1963. And he stayed with the Braves when they moved to Atlanta. So Bobby Bragan is actually the first manager in the history of the Atlanta Braves. Um, Now, bear in mind also that these pictures were taken in the spring of 1942. And at that point, quite a number of players had enlisted in the armed services. And World War II was, in fact, the United States' entry into World War II at that point was several months old. So some of these players, the story is that they are in the major leagues because of the fact that there was a shortage of players. That does not apply to Mr. Bragan, nor and not to Merrill May. Now Merrill May also not a great, memorable player, but played about also like a half a dozen years for the Phillies as a third baseman. Ultimately became a very long-term minor league manager. I think he managed into the 70s. But Merrill May would be more famous as the father of a baseball player by the name of Milt May. Milt May played for the Pirates and a few other teams in the 70s and 80s. And I believe he has a World Series ring with the 71 Pirates. Milt May would be a little bit more famous than his father, but his father was important in baseball as a manager in the minor leagues from the late 40s until the 70s. So those are the two pictures from from the Philadelphia Phillies spring training, which was in, as I said, Miami Beach, Florida. Both of these photos were taken from, it looks like, from the stands, and there's a little bit of a fencing you can see, and a rail, and the players must have turned around and said, hey, okay, I'll pose for a photo. So I'm assuming my grandfather went to a game, actually, in the Philadelphia Phillies spring training facility in Miami Beach, Florida. So the next set of photos, there are two more this is from Sanford, Florida. And as I said to you before, Sanford, Florida is nowhere near Miami Beach or Fort Lauderdale. It's north of Orlando. And this is where the Boston Bees, now the Boston Braves were known as the Braves for decades. And then for several years in the 40s, they were known as the Bees. And I looked this up. They trained in Sanford, Florida for all of one season, which would be 1942. So these photos are cool because there is a Hall of Famer in here. But first I'll show you this one, which is a two-person photo. It looks like it's right on the outfield or sort of maybe outside of the outfield, but there's no fencing in between. This is Max West and Tony Cuccinello. Max West was a first baseman outfielder, had a decent career, made the the All-Star game in, I believe, 1940, and hit a 3-run home run, which ended up being the difference in the game, was the starting right fielder. Tony Cuccinello is a multiple All-Star second baseman who played for a variety of teams, including Boston, the Boston Bees, Brooklyn, and I can't remember the other team, but Cuccinello was actually an All-Star in the very first All-Star game in 1933, and he has a card in the 33 Gaudy set, card I probably should have had before I brought this video going. But anyway, Cuccinello is a major player. Cuccinello did get was a coach for the 1959 Go-Go White Sox because he was friends with Al Lopez. And then later on, he was the third base coach for the 1968 Tigers. So he got a World Series ring very late in his career. So Cuccinello is also kind of a major player in baseball history. And so he also was in a photo with Paul Waner. That is Hall of Famer Paul Waner playing for the Boston Bees in 1942. But let me just go back for 1 second for Cuccinello. He stopped playing in 1940, and in 1941 he became the manager of the Jersey City team in the minor leagues, but was asked to come back to play in 1942 because, as I said before, quite a number of players had already enlisted in the armed services. But so Cuccinello played from 42 to 45 or 46. I think it might have been 45. He finished second in the batting title, and then when everybody came back from the war, he was promptly released and became a coach again. But anyway, Paul Waner was in the shall we say, waning days of his career in 1942. As you know, he was a major player for the Pirates in the 20s and 30s. Had more than 200 hits, like 7 or 8 seasons. He has over 3,000 hits. But by 1942, he was, I think, 40 years old. He played a couple more years. During the war years, his career was extended because he was not in the armed services. So Paul Waner does have a card in the 1933 Gotti set. And this is it. It's an SGC3. This is, of course, an iconic card from that set from the great Hall of Famer Paul Waner. So those photos are also in some slides here. That's the Phillies. Here's the Boston Bees, I'm sorry. There's Max West and Cuccinello and Paul Waner and Cuccinello. And the photos are taken almost in the exact same spot. You can see that advertising on the wall behind them. And it looks like it might be just outside the gate going into the field, or maybe just inside the gate. Hard to say, but my grandfather was in Sanford, Florida in 1942 to take these photos, including Hall of Famer Paul Waner. So the other place that he went was where he was a fan of the team. It was in St. Petersburg, Florida. I'm sorry, I said Fort Lauderdale. It's St. Petersburg, Florida, where the Yankees were doing spring training. And we have 4 pictures of the Yankees, one of which is a fairly, not that anonymous, but Buddy Hassett was a first baseman throughout the 1930s. He ultimately came to the Yankees in 1942 and was the starting first baseman for the entire season. The 42 Yankees won 103 games and went to the World Series, where they lost to Stan Musial and a young Stan Musial and the Cardinals. So Buddy Hassett played in the World Series for the Yankees in 1942, and then that was it. He went into the armed services, and after that did not come back into the major leagues. These photographs, as you can see, are taken in what looks like the parking lot. What's so cool about these is you can see the cars, the 1940s cars in the background, which is so great. So the Yankees, I guess, were in St. Petersburg at that point. The next photo is an interesting player by the name of Jerry Pretty. Jerry Pretty came up at the same time as Phil Rizzuto, and they were both infielders, and they were both touted rookies. Pretty was actually more touted than Phil Rizzuto, but he was a bit of a problem as a person. They called him a clubhouse lawyer, which I guess means he got into everyone's business and tried to argue with people. And so he was ultimately traded. He played 42 with the Yankees. He was traded to the Washington Senators in 43. He did a couple of years in the service, and then he came back and was actually an all-star, a quality player for several years. Jerry Pretty ultimately had a bad experience because he went to jail. He committed extortion in California and did some time in prison. He also worked in the movie industry. He was a consultant on several baseball movies in the 50s, but he ultimately went to prison, and then he died at, I don't think, the age of 50 or so. So Pretty's kind of a sad story. But this is him in what I believe was his rookie year or second year, right outside the Yankees spring training site in St. Petersburg, Florida. Now, this gentleman is George Selkirk. George Selkirk, by 1942, was a reserve outfielder, but throughout the 1930s, he was, in fact, in the outfield with DiMaggio, and he was the member of 5 consecutive World Series titles as a starting player. I believe Selkirk made a couple of all-star teams. So fine player from the Yankees, not particularly well known, but I know right now I'm bidding on a George Selkirk autographed 1939 play ball card in the Love of the Game auction, which ends in about a week. So don't outbid me, please. Anyway, so here's George Selkirk. And then the last one, which is the only player, when I was a kid, is the only player I knew from this group. A group of really good players, including another Hall of Famer. But this is a Hall of Famer, and the famous Phil Rizzuto. This predates Phil Rizzuto's rookie card with Bowman in 1948. Phil Rizzuto came up in 41, so this is taken in 1942, which is, I believe, also in the same parking lot with these cool 1940s cars in the background. Little bit of a what looks like some sort of lighting issue, giving that white spot on the photo. But Phil Rizzuto, as we know, is a Hall of Famer, famous Yankee. Came up in 1941, multiple All-Star, 1950 MVP, World Series hero, World Series winner, like, I don't know, 5 or 6 times. Ultimately became the Yankees announcer for 40 years, and an iconic American person, American figure. And Phil Rizzuto, of course, has many cards, and I chose to pull out his 1953 Bowman with the classic bunting pose inside of Yankee Stadium. So those are my grandfather's pictures. And let me just show you the up close of the Yankees. There's Hassett and Pretty, as you can see, the background with the cars. There's Phil Rizzuto and George Selkirk. So those are my grandfather's photos from 1942. A family heirloom in the truest sense. And really happy to have them because they give me, like, not only a perspective of like baseball in the 40s, what the players were dressed like, what the field looked like, what the parking lot with the cars, and it's just sort of a historical artifact. But it also tells me something about my family history and my grandfather being a baseball fan, and that is really cool to me. And so anyway, this is just me alone, obviously. I will have guests. Next week is the Saturday after Thanksgiving. I'm going to have family in. I'm not going to really have an opportunity to do a video, but the following week, I do have an exciting guest lined up to talk about one particular Boston player, star-crossed player. And then I have the Ted Williams show will be on the 9th. And after that, I have two guests for another show of a Boston Red Sox Hall of Famer. And then I've got another guest lined up to talk about about a Brooklyn player. So guests lined up for the rest of the year. Lots to talk about. But anyway, thanks for tuning in. And we'll see you in 2 weeks. And have a great Thanksgiving. Take care.